I'm Will, 32, and I've spent my life in the shadow of my wildly successful sister. Growing up middle class taught me the value of a dollar, unlike Rebecca, who measures worth by price tags. When she invited our family to that upscale restaurant, I knew I was in for another evening of subtle jabs. But nothing prepared me for the moment. She looked at me with that smirk and said, "Can you even afford to eat here?" Then the waiter walked over with a smile that changed everything. Before I tell you how this one moment transformed our family forever, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better. The gap between Rebecca and me started early in our childhood home in Boston. While most siblings compete over toys or parental attention, our battlefield was achievement. Rebecca was the golden child from the moment she brought home her first straight-A report card in elementary school. By high school, she was class president, valedictorian, and had already secured a scholarship to Princeton. Meanwhile, I was the average student who preferred hands-on projects to textbooks and found my joy in community service rather than academic competition. Our parents never explicitly favored Rebecca, but their pride was unmistakable whenever she achieved something new. When she graduated from Princeton with honors, they threw an extravagant party and invited everyone they knew. When I finished my associate's degree at Boston Community College, I got a casual dinner at our regular family restaurant. "Will just needs to find his path," my mother would say to relatives, her voice tinged with subtle disappointment. My father, an accountant who valued financial stability above all else, would nod in agreement while listing Rebecca's latest accomplishments. After college, our paths diverged even further. Rebecca landed a prestigious position at Morgan Stanley, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. By 30, she was driving a BMW, living in a downtown penthouse apartment, and vacationing in places I couldn't even pronounce correctly. Her Instagram feed looked like a luxury lifestyle magazine, perfectly curated to display success. My journey took more turns. I worked as a barista, then a bookstore manager, then tried my hand at freelance graphic design. Nothing quite stuck. 6 months ago, I lost my position at a marketing firm when the company downsized. Instead of immediately hunting for a new corporate job, I decided to volunteer at a community center teaching basic computer skills to underprivileged youth and the elderly. The work paid nothing but gave me more satisfaction than any paid position I'd ever held. When Rebecca called to invite the family to dinner at Le Chateau, one of the most expensive restaurants in Boston, my stomach knotted. The dinner was supposedly to celebrate her recent promotion to senior investment director, but these family gatherings had become showcases for her success, and by contrast, my lack thereof. "You have to come," my mother insisted when I tried to beg off. "It's important to Rebecca, and it's just one evening." Just one evening of feeling inadequate, I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I agreed, partly out of family obligation, and partly because I didn't want to explain to my parents why I couldn't afford to split the bill at a place where appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Le Chateau wasn't just expensive, it was intimidating by design. Located in a renovated historic building with stone walls and crystal chandeliers, it catered to Boston's elite. The kind of place where the menu didn't display prices, operating under the assumption that if you needed to ask, you couldn't afford it. The waitstaff wore tailored black suits that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. As I stood outside its imposing entrance on that chilly autumn evening, I adjusted my only decent button-up shirt and wished I owned a tie that wasn't from my college graduation. Through the windows, I could see people in designer clothes laughing over wine glasses that caught the soft lighting, creating tiny constellations across white tablecloths. I checked my wallet one last time, calculating how much I could reasonably spend without eating ramen for the next 2 weeks. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the weight of it matching the heaviness in my chest. The maitre d' gave my casual outfit a subtle once-over. Before I mentioned Rebecca's reservation, his expression shifting from judgment to professional courtesy as he realized I was connected to a recognized client. This was going to be a long night of pretending I belonged in my sister's world while knowing I was just visiting and an unwelcome visitor at that. The interior of Le Chateau was even more intimidating up close. Velvet drapes framed tall windows, and original oil paintings adorned walls that had probably witnessed centuries of Boston's elite dining and opulence. The maitre d' led me through the main dining area, where conversations were conducted in hushed, confident tones that spoke of business deals and old money. My parents were already seated at a round table draped in pristine white linen. My father wore his standard business suit, the same one he wore to weddings and funerals, while my mother had clearly invested in a new dress for the occasion, something floral and tasteful that still somehow screamed, trying to fit in. "Will." My mother stood to hug me, her perfume enveloping me in a cloud of Chanel. "You made it. Rebecca's just running a few minutes late client call. You know how it is." I didn't know, but I nodded anyway as I took my seat, immediately noting the array of silverware that seemed excessive for the single task of transporting food from plate to mouth. "How's the job hunt going?" my father asked, his question innocent enough but loaded with expectation. "It's going," I answered vaguely, taking a sip of ice water to avoid elaborating. I hadn't told them I'd essentially paused my search to focus on volunteer work. That conversation would need to wait for a less public setting. 20 minutes later, Rebecca made her entrance. She didn't just walk into the restaurant. She arrived, turning heads as she navigated between tables with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged. Her black designer dress was accented with a single strand of pearls, and her hair was styled in a sleek bob that framed her face perfectly. She looked successful, there was no other word for it. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, air-kissing our mother's cheek before taking her seat. "The Singapore market opened, and I had to handle a situation." She said it casually, as if managing international finance was as routine as picking up dry cleaning. "That's my girl, always in demand." Our father beamed, pride evident in every crease of his smile. I took another sip of water, already feeling invisible. A waiter appeared almost immediately to take Rebecca's drink order. "The usual, Miss David? The Veuve Clicquot?" "Yes, and let's get a bottle for the table." "We're celebrating tonight," she proclaimed. I winced internally, knowing that even a quarter of that bottle would strain my budget. As the champagne was poured, Rebecca launched into the story of her promotion, complete with details about her increased signing authority and the size of her new corner office. Our parents hung on every word, occasionally glancing at each other with looks that silently communicated their satisfaction with how well their daughter had turned out. "Enough about me," Rebecca finally said after nearly 30 minutes of monologue. "Will, what are you up to these days? Still at that marketing company?" The question was delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew very well I'd been let go. I'd mentioned it during our last family dinner 2 months ago. "Actually, I've been doing some volunteer work while I figure out my next move," I said, trying to infuse my voice with the same confidence she projected so effortlessly. "Volunteer work? How?" "Fulfilling," Rebecca replied, the slight pause, saying more than her words. "But it doesn't pay the bills, does it?" My mother quickly jumped in. "Will's always been so community-minded. Remember when he organized that book drive in high school?" Rebecca's smile tightened. "Of course. Will's always been good with small-scale projects." The waiter returned to take our orders. I scanned the menu quickly, my eyes widening at prices that seemed more appropriate for small appliances than food. I settled on the cheapest entree I could find, a pasta dish that was still more expensive than any meal I'd eaten in months. Rebecca, naturally, ordered the lobster and a side of seasonal truffles, then proceeded to question the waiter about the wine list with the expertise of a sommelier. After selecting a bottle that cost roughly my monthly rent, she turned to me with that familiar look of superiority. "You should try the filet mignon, Will. It's divine here," she suggested, knowing full well I'd chosen the pasta for financial reasons. "The pasta sounds great, actually," I replied, forcing a smile. "Are you sure?" "My treat tonight, so don't hold back," she offered, her generosity feeling more like charity. "I'm good with the pasta, thanks." My voice came out sharper than intended. An awkward silence descended on the table, broken only when the waiter returned with bread and Rebecca's specially selected olive oil that she insisted we try instead of the restaurant's standard offering. As our parents asked Rebecca questions about her new responsibilities, I found myself fading into the background of the conversation. I buttered a piece of bread and wondered how soon I could politely leave without seeming ungrateful. When the first course arrived, a small plate of scallops that Rebecca had ordered for the table to share, she launched into a story about her recent vacation to the Maldives, complete with private cabanas and personal chefs. "You really should take some time off, Will," she said between bites. "Travel broadens the mind. Though I suppose you need a job first, before you can take vacation days." She laughed lightly as if she'd made a harmless joke. My parents chuckled uncomfortably, clearly aware of the tension but unwilling to address it. "I've been pretty busy with the community center," I said. "We're helping people build resumes and develop interview skills." "That's nice," Rebecca replied dismissively before turning to our father. "Dad, you should see the investment portfolio I've developed for this quarter. The returns are incredible." As the main courses arrived, Rebecca continued to dominate the conversation, occasionally throwing questions my way that seemed designed to highlight the differences in our situations. When the waiter asked if I wanted wine from the bottle Rebecca had ordered, I declined, knowing I needed to drive home and couldn't afford a taxi. "Can you even afford to eat here?" Rebecca finally asked after I passed on dessert. The question was delivered with a smile, but there was no mistaking the mockery in her tone. "I mean, if you're between jobs, this place must be quite outside your budget. Good thing your successful sister can treat you." I felt heat rising to my face as our parents looked uncomfortable, but said nothing to defend me. The question hung in the air like a bad smell, and I struggled to find a response that wouldn't turn dinner into a scene. That's when the waiter walked over with a smile that would change everything. "Mr. David." "Welcome back, sir," the waiter exclaimed with genuine warmth, his professional demeanor momentarily replaced by friendly recognition. "Would you like your usual table? I see you're with family tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. My father, who had been taking a sip of his expensive wine, nearly choked, coughing into his napkin while my mother's eyes widened to an almost comical degree. Rebecca's expression was priceless, her perfectly maintained mask of superiority cracking to reveal utter confusion. I stared at the waiter Michael, according to his name tag, trying desperately to place him. He was about my age, with dark hair and a friendly face that seemed vaguely familiar, but I couldn't recall ever dining at Le Chateau before tonight. I certainly didn't have a usual table at a restaurant where the cheapest wine cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I began, not wanting to embarrass Michael, but completely lost as to what was happening. "Oh, I apologize for interrupting your family dinner," Michael continued smoothly, either not noticing or politely ignoring my confusion. "Chef Antoine mentioned you might be coming in tonight. He's already preparing that special dish you enjoyed last time." My mind raced. Chef Antoine? Special dish? Last time? I had never met a professional chef in my life, let alone had one prepare special dishes for me. There had to be some mistake. A case of mistaken identity, perhaps. "I think you might have me confused with someone else," I started to say, but Michael was already shaking his head. "Not at all, sir. After what you did for the restaurant, you're unmistakable. Mr. Beaumont said to move your party to the private dining room whenever you arrived." He gestured toward the back of the restaurant, where I could see a separate area cordoned off with velvet ropes. Rebecca found her voice. "Will?" she said with a strained smile. "You didn't mention you were a regular here." "I'm not," I replied honestly, looking back at Michael with growing bewilderment. "Mr. David is being modest," Michael said with a knowing smile. "Your brother has been instrumental to Le Chateau over the past few months. Mr. Beaumont considers him practically family." My father had recovered from his coughing fit and was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and newfound interest. "Beaumont?" my mother asked. "The owner?" Michael nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Beaumont speaks very highly of your son. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd be honored to move your party to the private dining room. The view of the garden is particularly lovely tonight." Before anyone could protest, Michael was signaling to another staff member, and suddenly our table was being cleared with remarkable efficiency. Rebecca sat frozen, her champagne halfway to her lips, watching the scene unfold with visible disbelief. As we stood to follow Michael, my mind flashed back to 3 months ago, a community outreach event I'd volunteered at near the harbor. There had been a young man there, volunteering alongside me, helping to serve meals to homeless veterans. We'd chatted briefly about cooking and food insecurity in Boston. Could that have been Michael? But that wouldn't explain his behavior now, or this apparent connection to Le Chateau. We were led through the main dining area, past tables of well-heeled patrons who glanced up with interest as we passed. I felt absurdly like a celebrity being escorted to VIP seating, though I had done nothing to earn such treatment. Rebecca walked stiffly beside me, her earlier confidence noticeably diminished. "Will," she whispered urgently, "what is going on? How do you know these people?" "I honestly have no idea," I whispered back, which only earned me a look of disbelief. The private dining room was spectacular, a smaller, more intimate space, with a wall of windows overlooking an illuminated garden. A large table was already set with fine china and crystal, fresh flowers arranged in a stunning centerpiece. "Your usual wine, Mr. David?" Michael asked as we took our seats, now thoroughly confused but going along with the bizarre situation. "Aye. That would be lovely, thank you," I managed to reply, having no idea what my usual might be but deciding it was easier to play along than cause a scene. As Michael left to fetch the wine, my family turned to me with expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. "William David." My mother used my full name, a sure sign of her agitation. "What aren't you telling us? How are you a VIP at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Boston when you've been telling us you're struggling financially?" "I'm not a VIP, I insisted, "and I am struggling financially. There's been some mistake. Some mistake that includes the staff knowing your name, the chef preparing you special dishes, and the owner considering you family." Rebecca's voice had an edge. I recognized the same tone she used when catching me in a lie when we were children. Before I could formulate a response, the door to the private dining room opened, and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s entered. He wore an impeccably tailored suit and moved with the confident air of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Will David," he exclaimed, approaching our table with arms outstretched. "What a delightful surprise. When Michael said you were dining with us tonight, I had to come say hello personally." And suddenly, looking at this man's face, recognition dawned. Not from Le Chateau, but from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that made this surreal evening begin to make a strange sort of sense. "Mr. Beaumont," I said, the name suddenly clicking into place as I rose to shake his hand. Antoine Beaumont, owner of Le Chateau, but more significantly to me, the father of Elijah Beaumont, a 17-year-old boy from the youth program at the community center. "Please, I've told you to call me Antoine," he insisted, clasping my hand warmly between both of his. "Your family must be so proud of you. I know I've sung your praises to anyone who will listen." My parents and Rebecca stared at us, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. I could practically see the questions forming in their minds as they watched this influential man treat me, the family underachiever, like a valued friend. "I'm sorry," Rebecca interrupted, her composure partially restored as she extended her hand. "I'm Rebecca David, Will's sister. I don't believe we've met, though I'm apparently the only one at the table who hasn't had the pleasure." Antoine shook her hand briefly before turning his attention back to me. "Will hasn't mentioned you? Well, he's always been modest about his connections, too focused on helping others to talk about himself." "Helping others?" my father repeated, giving me a questioning look. Antoine pulled up a chair, settling in as if preparing to tell a story. "Has Will not told you about his work with my son? About how he quite literally changed our lives?" My mother shook her head slowly. "Will mentioned he's been doing volunteer work, but he didn't share any specifics." He felt a flush creeping up my neck. The volunteer work at the community center had become increasingly important to me, but I'd downplayed it to my family, knowing they valued traditional success, career advancement, financial stability over community service. "Then allow me to enlighten you," Antoine said, signaling to a waiter. "And please, tonight's meal is compliments of the house. It's the least I can do." "That's really not necessary," I started to protest, but Antoine waved away my objection. "My son Elijah was heading down a dangerous path," he began, his expression growing serious. "Despite all the advantages I could provide, the best schools, private tutors, every material comfort, he was failing classes hanging out with a troubling crowd, experimenting with substances. My wife and I tried everything: therapy, stricter discipline, even a brief stint at a military-style academy. Nothing reached him. As Antoine spoke, fragments of conversations with Elijah came back to me. The angry teenager who'd been mandated to complete community service hours after a vandalism incident, the kid who'd shown up at the center with a chip on his shoulder and designer clothes that set him apart from the other youth. I hadn't known he was the son of a restaurant owner, let alone the proprietor of Le Chateau. 3 months ago, Elijah was caught spray painting graffiti on public property, Antoine continued. The judge gave him a choice: juvenile detention or community service. Thank God he chose the latter and ended up at the Harbor Community Center. That's where I volunteer. I explain to my family, finding my voice. I teach basic computer skills and help with the youth program, where Will saw something in my son that everyone else had missed, Antoine added. Not a delinquent, but a creative young man with a passion for food and no proper outlet for his talents. I remembered the breakthrough clearly. During a community meal preparation session, Elijah had taken over the kitchen, transforming simple donated ingredients into a dish that had amazed everyone. When I'd asked where he learned to cook like that, he'd shrugged and mentioned watching cooking shows to escape the pressure of being a restaurateur's son. Will didn't just supervise Elijah's community service hours, Antoine explained, his voice thick with emotion. He created a special program, connecting Elijah with a local culinary training initiative. He recognized my son's talent and gave him something I never could: permission to love food without the weight of my expectations. A waiter appeared with a bottle of wine, pouring a small amount for Antoine to taste before serving each of us. I recognized the label: an expensive vintage that would have cost me a week's worth of pay at my last job. But that's not all, Antoine continued after approving the wine. When Elijah wanted to drop out of his private school to pursue culinary training full-time, Will mediated our family discussions. He helped me understand my son's perspective and helped Elijah understand the value of completing his education while pursuing his passion. Rebecca was watching me with an unreadable expression, her earlier mockery replaced by something more complex. Today, Elijah is back in school, maintaining a B average and apprenticing in our kitchen on weekends, Antoine said proudly. He's developing a new farm-to-table program that will connect Le Chateau with local urban farms, including the community garden Will helped establish. My mother reached over to squeeze my hand, her eyes glistening. You never told us any of this, Will. I shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. It didn't seem like a big deal compared to Rebecca's career achievements. Not a big deal? Antoine looked genuinely shocked. Will, you saved my family. You reached my son when no one else could. That's worth more than any business success I've ever had. The door opened again, and a tall man in chef's whites entered, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw me. Will, I thought that might be you. I've been preparing something special since Michael told me you were here. Chef Bernard, Le Chateau's head chef and apparently another person I'd inadvertently impressed, approached our table with enthusiasm. Chef Bernard has been mentoring Elijah personally, Antoine explained to my bewildered family. Ever since Will connected them through the culinary program. Your brother is quite remarkable, Chef Bernard told Rebecca. When he organized that cooking workshop for our staff at the community center, he changed how we think about food waste and community engagement. The recipe collection we developed together has become a training manual for our kitchen. I remembered the workshop a simple idea to have professional chefs teach community members how to create nutritious meals from commonly donated food items. I hadn't realized the impact it had made on the participating restaurants. We're launching a new initiative next month, Chef Bernard continued excitedly, teaching culinary skills to homeless community members with potential employment opportunities here and at other restaurants in our group. It was inspired entirely by Will's program at the center. Rebecca was now staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. My father, who had always measured success in promotions and salary increases, appeared to be reconsidering his metrics. Will never mentioned any of this, my mother said, her voice a mixture of pride and confusion. That's Will, Antoine chuckled, always focusing on the work rather than taking credit. When he refused payment for the consulting he did for our community outreach program, I insisted he at least accept lifetime dining privileges here at Le Chateau, though I notice he rarely uses them. And suddenly, the waiter's recognition made sense. I had been to Le Chateau before, but in a very different capacity, helping to design their community engagement program, training staff on working with at-risk youth, connecting them with local food banks. I hadn't thought of it as consulting work, just as an extension of my volunteer efforts. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, I said quietly. Well, tonight we are making a big deal of it, Antoine declared, standing up. Chef Bernard has prepared a special tasting menu, and I've selected wines to match each course. This is a celebration not just of Rebecca's promotion, congratulations, by the way, but of Will's extraordinary impact on our restaurant and my family. As Antoine excused himself to check on preparations, I found myself the center of attention at our family table for perhaps the first time in my adult life. The shift was palpable and disorienting. Rebecca's expression had morphed from confusion to something more complicated, a mixture of disbelief, reassessment, and perhaps a touch of something that looked uncomfortably like shame. After Antoine left, an awkward silence descended on our table. My parents exchanged glances, clearly processing this new information about their son, whom they had long categorized as underachieving. Rebecca swirled her wine glass, staring into the crimson liquid as if it might provide answers. I need to use the restroom, she finally announced, placing her napkin beside her plate. Then, with a pointed look at me, she added, Will, would you mind showing me where it is? I'd like a word with my brother. Our parents didn't seem to find this request strange, despite the fact that any waiter could have directed her. I nodded and stood, following Rebecca out of the private dining room and into the main restaurant area. Instead of heading toward the bathrooms, however, she steered us toward a quiet alcove near the restaurant's impressive wine cellar. Once we were relatively private, she turned to face me, arms crossed defensively across her chest. What exactly is going on here, Will? She demanded, her voice low but intense. You've been letting us believe you're struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, when apparently you're some kind of, what? Secret philanthropist with connections to Boston's elite? I sighed, leaning against the wall. I am struggling financially, Rebecca. Everything I told you about losing my job was true. The work I do at the community center is volunteer unpaid. The fact that it connected me to people like Antoine was never part of some master plan. But you have lifetime dining privileges at one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants, she countered, making air quotes. Do you have any idea how many clients I had to land to get a reservation here my first time? I don't use the privileges, I pointed out. Tonight is literally the first time I've eaten here as a guest. The other times I've been here were for meetings about their community programs or to help train staff. Rebecca ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, momentarily disrupting its sleek shape. I don't understand. Why wouldn't you use a perk like that? Why wouldn't you even mention it to us? Do you know how impressed Dad would have been? The question struck at the heart of something I'd never articulated, even to myself. That's exactly why I didn't mention it, I admitted. Because it would have been the first time Dad was impressed by something I did, and it would have been about where I could eat, not who I was helping. Rebecca's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing her features before she reinforced her defensive posture. So what, this is some kind of moral high ground you're claiming? Rebecca cares about material success while virtuous, Will focuses on helping others? Is that the narrative you're crafting here? There's no narrative, I insisted, frustration building. I'm just living my life according to what feels meaningful to me. I never criticized your choices. You didn't have to. Rebecca's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing around to ensure we weren't creating a scene. Every time you turn down a networking opportunity I offer or change the subject when I talk about investments, it's a judgment. It's you saying my values aren't good enough. I stared at her, genuinely surprised. That's how you interpreted that? Rebecca, I changed the subject because I thought you found my life boring in comparison. I thought you were embarrassed by my lack of success. Something in her carefully maintained facade cracked then a momentary glimpse of vulnerability that I hadn't seen since we were children. I'm not embarrassed by you, she said, her voice suddenly less certain. I don't know. Maybe I'm threatened. Threatened? By me? The concept seemed so absurd I almost laughed. You're the one with the corner office and the investment portfolio, and you're the one who apparently has the respect of people like Antoine Beaumont, not because of what you can do for their bottom line, but because of who you are. She looked away, staring at an ornate light fixture. Do you know how hard I've tried to get personal relationships with clients like him? How many hours I've spent researching their interests, memorizing details about their families, all to make a connection that you achieved just by being yourself. I had never considered that Rebecca, with all her accomplishments and confidence, might see anything in my life worth envying. The revelation shifted something fundamental in how I viewed our relationship. Our parents always favored you, I said quietly. You were the one they bragged about to friends and relatives. I was just the son they had to make excuses for. Rebecca laughed, but it was hollow. Is that what you think? Will, they expected nothing from you, which gave you the freedom to find your own path. Every accomplishment I achieved just raised the bar for the next one. Do you have any idea what that pressure feels like? We stood in silence, two adults suddenly recognizing that we'd been operating under false assumptions about each other's lives for years. When I made that comment about you not being able to afford this place, Rebecca finally said, "It wasn't really about you. It was about me needing to feel superior because beneath all this," she gestured to her designer dress and carefully curated appearance, "I'm terrified of failure. One misstep, one bad investment call, and everything I've built could collapse. Meanwhile, you've created something real connections, impact, meaning that can't be measured in a quarterly report." I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. For years, I'd felt inferior to my brilliant sister, never realizing she was fighting her own battles with insecurity. Why have we never talked like this before? I asked. Because it's easier to maintain the roles we established as kids, she replied with surprising insight. You as the underachiever, me as the success story. Breaking out of those patterns would require us to reevaluate everything about our relationship. I was about to respond when Michael appeared at the entrance to the alcove. Excuse me, Mr. David. Miss David. But Chef Bernard is ready to serve the first course. Mr. Beaumont asked me to find you. Rebecca straightened her posture, the vulnerable moment passing as she reassembled her public persona. We'll be right there. Thank you. As we walked back toward the private dining room, she paused, touching my arm lightly. This conversation isn't over, she said quietly, but I think we both have some processing to do. I nodded, sensing that something fundamental had shifted between us, a crack in the walls we'd built that might, with care, allow for a new kind of relationship to grow. When we returned to the private dining room, the atmosphere had transformed. The lighting was softer, background music played gently, and our parents were chatting animatedly with Chef Bernard, who was describing the evening's special menu. The tension that had characterized our earlier family dinner had dissipated, replaced by a genuine warmth that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Ah, there they are, Chef Bernard exclaimed as we took our seats. I was just telling your parents about the first time Will came to our kitchen. He organized a cooking class for teenagers from the community center, and one of them was so nervous he dropped an entire tray of pastries. Will got down on his hands and knees alongside our pastry chef to clean it up, then spent an hour helping the boy recreate everything from scratch. My father looked at me with new eyes. You never mentioned any of this, son. I shrugged, uncomfortable with the focus on what had seemed like simple acts of kindness. It didn't come up. Will's problem, Antoine said as he rejoined us, is that he doesn't recognize the extraordinary impact he has. To him, it's just Tuesday. The first course arrived an artfully plated appetizer that Chef Bernard described as inspired by the community garden Will helped establish. Each ingredient had been sourced from urban farms that employed formerly homeless individuals, creating a story on the plate that went beyond mere sustenance. As we ate, I found myself sharing details of my volunteer work for the first time, how the computer literacy program had expanded to include job skills training, how several participants had secured employment through connections we'd developed with local businesses, how we'd recently received a small grant to establish a mentorship initiative. What made you decide to focus on this kind of work? My mother asked. genuinely curious in a way she had never been about my previous jobs. I considered the question. I guess I realized I was happiest when I was making a direct positive difference in someone's life. The marketing job paid well, but at the end of each day, I couldn't point to anything concrete I'd accomplished beyond helping sell products people probably didn't need. My father, who had always prioritized financial security, looked thoughtful. But how do you support yourself? Volunteer work doesn't pay the bills. I've been living off savings, I admitted, and doing some freelance graphic design when I can find it. It's not sustainable long term, but the work feels important enough to make the temporary sacrifice worthwhile. Antoine, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. Will, I've been meaning to discuss something with you. Le Chateau and our restaurant group have been so impressed with the programs you've developed that we'd like to formalize our relationship. We're creating a new position, Community Impact Director, to expand the initiatives you've started. It would involve working with all 5 of our restaurants to implement education programs, employment pathways, and food security initiatives. I stared at him, processing his words. You're offering me a job? A career, he corrected, with a salary commensurate with the value you've already demonstrated. We've already seen how your programs improve staff retention and community goodwill, not to mention the tax benefits of our increased charitable activities. Rebecca, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since our conversation in the alcove, spoke up. That's a smart business move, actually. Community engagement programs have been shown to increase brand loyalty and customer retention. There are studies demonstrating the ROI on such initiatives is quite significant. Antoine nodded appreciatively. Exactly. This isn't charity. It's sound business practice, with the added benefit of making a positive difference. The second course arrived a soup made from ingredients that would typically be discarded as food waste, transformed into something delicious through creative technique. As Chef Bernard explained the concept of root-to-stem cooking that Elijah had been exploring, I saw my parents exchanging looks of growing pride. Will has always had an eye for potential that others miss, my mother said softly. Even as a child, he would befriend the kids everyone else overlooked. The evening continued with course after course, each telling a story connected to the community work I'd been doing. Through it all, I watched Rebecca observing, calculating, reassessing. She participated in the conversation, but seemed to be processing something internally, her usual need to dominate the discussion noticeably absent. When the dessert course arrived, a collaboration between Chef Bernard and Elijah himself, who had created a modern interpretation of our grandmother's apple pie recipe that I had apparently mentioned once in passing. Antoine raised his glass. To making a difference in ways both large and small, he toasted. And to the David family, who raised a son with the wisdom to see value where others see only problems. My parents beamed, clearly basking in pride they had rarely felt toward my accomplishments. My father, who had spent my entire adulthood asking when I would find a real career, was nodding with satisfaction at the prospect of my new position. As we enjoyed the dessert, Rebecca finally broke her relative silence. Will, I've been thinking about your community center's job skills program. Would you be open to having some of my colleagues from Morgan Stanley conduct financial literacy workshops? Many of us have pro bono hours we need to fulfill, and it could be beneficial to your participants. The offer caught me off guard. It was the first time Rebecca had shown interest in my work beyond polite questioning. That would be incredible, I replied sincerely. Personal finance is an area where many of our participants struggle, especially those transitioning from homelessness or financial instability. I could also look into whether any of our corporate philanthropy funds might be applicable to your programs, she added, a tentative olive branch that felt significant given our earlier confrontation. I'd appreciate that, I said, meeting her eyes and seeing something new there, a respect that had never been present before. As the meal concluded and coffee was served, the conversation flowed more naturally than any family discussion I could remember. My parents asked thoughtful questions about my work. Antoine shared stories about Elijah's progress, and even Rebecca contributed ideas about potential corporate partnerships that could benefit the community programs. For the first time in my adult life, I felt fully seen by my family not as the underachieving son who hadn't lived up to expectations, but as someone whose choices and values had merit on their own terms. The validation shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but I couldn't deny the warmth that spread through me as I watched my father listen intently to my explanation of a youth entrepreneurship program I hoped to develop. By the time we prepared to leave, something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. The hierarchy that had placed Rebecca at the top and me firmly at the bottom had been disrupted, creating space for a more balanced appreciation of our different paths and contributions. As Antoine escorted us to the door, insisting that the entire meal was complimentary despite my protests, I realized that success could be measured in many currencies, and perhaps, for the first time, my family was beginning to recognize the value of the one I had chosen. The cool night air felt refreshing after the emotional intensity of the evening. My parents had already said their goodbyes and were walking toward their car, deep in conversation that I suspected centered around the revelations about their son's unexpected impact. Rebecca and I lingered on the sidewalk outside Le Chateau, an awkward silence between us that felt pregnant with unspoken thoughts. The facade of the restaurant glowed warmly behind us, a perfect backdrop for the scene of reconciliation that seemed to be unfolding. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca finally said, her voice lacking its usual crisp confidence. "Not just for tonight, but for years of condescension and dismissal." "You don't have to," I began, but she cut me off with a raised hand. "Yes, I do. What I said in there about feeling threatened, that wasn't a heat-of-the-moment excuse. It was the truth." She looked directly at me, vulnerability evident in her expression. "I built my entire identity around being the successful one, the one who made all the right choices. Seeing you tonight, respected and valued for reasons that have nothing to do with money or status, it forced me to question what success actually means." I nodded, processing her words. "I've spent years feeling inadequate compared to you," I admitted. Every family gathering became an exercise in preparing explanations for why my life wasn't measuring up to yours. "God, we're a mess, aren't we?" Rebecca laughed, but there was no mockery in it, just the rueful recognition of two adults acknowledging the complicated dynamics that had shaped their relationship. "A work in progress," I corrected with a small smile. Rebecca adjusted her designer coat against the autumn chill. "I meant what I said about the financial literacy workshops, and I'd like to do more. My network, my resources, they could be useful to your community initiatives. If you're open to it." The offer represented more than practical assistance. It was an acknowledgement of the value of my work and an attempt to bridge the divide that had separated us for so long. "I'd appreciate that," I said sincerely, "but I need to know it's coming from the right place. Not guilt or some sudden need to balance cosmic scales. These are real people with real challenges, not a charity project to make anyone feel better about their privilege." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's fair. Maybe I could come by the center sometime, see the work firsthand before making any specific commitments." "I'd like that," I replied, recognizing the effort this represented for someone who scheduled her time in 15-minute increments and rarely ventured outside her carefully curated social circles. We promised to connect later in the week to arrange a visit, then parted ways, Rebecca to her downtown luxury apartment, me to my modest rental in a less fashionable neighborhood. Despite the continued contrast in our external circumstances, something had equalized between us, creating the possibility of a more authentic relationship. 1 month later, I stood in the expanded kitchen at the Harbor Community Center, watching as Rebecca guided a group of program participants through a workshop on building credit after homelessness or financial hardship. She had traded her designer suit for more casual attire, though I suspected even her casual clothes cost more than my entire wardrobe. Still, the participants responded to her expertise rather than her appearance, asking thoughtful questions about secured credit cards and responsible borrowing practices. In the corner, my father consulted with a young man about his small business plan, offering accounting advice that the participant could never have afforded on the open market. My mother moved between tables, her natural warmth making participants feel welcome as she served coffee and pastries donated by Le Chateau. The transformation in my family had been gradual but significant. After that pivotal dinner, my parents had begun showing interest in my work beyond perfunctory questions. My father, initially skeptical about the financial viability of community programs, had become increasingly engaged after seeing the tangible outcomes. My mother had discovered her own affinity for community service, volunteering regularly at events and forming genuine connections with participants. Rebecca's evolution had perhaps been the most surprising. Her initial visit to the center had led to a regular commitment, with her financial expertise becoming a valuable component of our job readiness program. She had leveraged her corporate connections to secure additional funding and in-kind donations, approaching the task with the same determination she applied to her investment portfolios. "Your sister's workshop has been really helpful," commented Elijah, who had become a regular volunteer in our culinary program while continuing his apprenticeship at Le Chateau. "Some of the participants are talking about opening savings accounts for the first time." I nodded, watching Rebecca in her element, explaining compound interest with genuine passion. She's found a way to apply her skills in a context that matters to her. The Community Kitchen initiative had expanded dramatically since Antoine's job offer. With formal backing from the restaurant group, we had established programs in 3 additional community centers, creating pathways to employment for dozens of participants who had previously faced significant barriers to stable work. My own role had evolved as well. While the position of Community Impact Director came with the financial stability I had been lacking, the true value was in the platform it provided to scale the programs I believed in. The work remained challenging and occasionally frustrating, but it offered a sense of purpose that no previous job had provided. "Will?" Rebecca approached as her workshop concluded, participants dispersing with handouts and newly created budget templates. "I've been thinking about expanding the financial literacy program to include investment basics for participants who have stabilized their situations. Would that be something people here would be interested in?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Once folks have secure housing and stable income, many of them want to build for the future, but don't know where to start." She nodded, already mentally planning. "I'll develop something appropriate, not the wealth management strategies I use with clients, but practical approaches for building security with limited resources." We walked together toward the break area, where our parents were chatting with community center staff. "It's strange," Rebecca said quietly. "I spent years chasing validation through promotions and performance reviews, but I've never felt professional satisfaction quite like seeing someone apply what I've taught them to improve their actual life circumstances." "Welcome to my world," I smiled. "That's the currency I've been working with all along." The healing in our family hadn't been instantaneous or perfect. We still had moments of misunderstanding and occasionally fell back into established patterns. My father sometimes slipped into asking about the financial metrics of my programs rather than their human impact. Rebecca's competitive nature occasionally emerged when discussing program outcomes. Old habits died hard, but we were learning a new way of relating to each other, one that acknowledged our differences, while recognizing the value in our diverse approaches to life. The rigid hierarchy that had placed career success and financial achievement at the top had given way to a more nuanced understanding of contribution and fulfillment. As we gathered for a family dinner that evening at a modest local restaurant rather than Le Chateau, by mutual agreement I looked around the table at the faces of my family members. My father, discussing a mentorship program he was developing for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. My mother, sharing stories about the community garden she had helped establish at a senior center. Rebecca, animated as she described a microfinance initiative she was researching to support small business development in our programs. The transformation wasn't about abandoning ambition or success. Rebecca was still excelling in her career. My father still valued financial prudence. My mother still appreciated the finer things in life. Rather, it was about expanding the definition of what constituted a life well lived, creating space for multiple forms of achievement and contribution. For me, the greatest lesson had been learning that true worth isn't determined by a paycheck or a title, but by the impact we have on the lives around us. Sometimes that impact comes through traditional success and the resources it provides. Sometimes it comes through direct service and personal connection. Both have value when approached with integrity and purpose. As I look back on that pivotal evening at Le Chateau, I'm grateful not for the validation it provided, though that was certainly welcome, but for the conversations it sparked and the growth it initiated. The waiter's smile and unexpected recognition didn't just change one dinner. It created an opening for my family to see each other more fully and appreciate the diverse ways we each contribute to the world. So I ask you, watching this right now, how do you measure success in your own life? Is it through traditional markers like salary and status, or through the relationships you build and the difference you make? Perhaps like my family, you're learning that both can have their place. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that worth comes in many forms. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most valuable currency isn't found in your wallet, but in the lives you touch along the way.